Hello and welcome to Rule of Carnage, a video and or podcast where we talk about designing better miniature games. My name's Mike. I design miniature games, some of which could be better, and he's Glenn. So today, Glenn, we're going to continue a discussion that we began in an earlier video, or indeed just a moment ago, if you're listening to the podcast, which is we were talking about setting and theme in tabletop games and how that relates to the game design process. Now, you had asked an interesting question, which is why are some themes or genres so prevalent in tabletop games? Why are there so many fantasy games and science fiction battle games and not all of the other wonderful genres you find in fiction, both audio visual and paper based? Why is that?
I mean, one of the things I think is interesting is how much post-apocalyptic there is on the tabletop specifically. I mean, I think they often divide fantasy, historic, sci-fi, but given how small of a genre post-apocalyptic really is, it's like a subsection of a subsection.
Yeah, if we're talking about books and movies as a if you measure the weight of post-apocalyptic fiction versus everything else.
Yeah, there's a lot of tabletop miniature skirmish games that are set in post-apocalyptic world. I mean, I do have a theory about
because the terrain is easy to make. That's why.
Well, I think it's all right. Well, I think personally, it's that in the modern day, the amount of violent conflict that the average person encounters is thankfully a quite sort of minimum level. And the people who do encounter regular violent conflict are very specific individuals in very sort of specific locations. And I think that most of those themes give license to imagine a world where every average person is involved in some level or another of constant violent conflict. I mean, talking about a great sci-fi setting, Warhammer 40k, there is only constant war. Is sort of the idea of that grim dark universe is that it's just war, and the whole purpose of civilization is to churn people into this eternal mincing. It's like 1984 writ large. The whole of society is mashing people into this war machine. I think also one of the reasons that drives a relatively narrow set of genres, of themes, is the explanation for there being a variety of weaponry. Because one of the problems about modern warfare is everyone's pretty much carrying the same gun and using the same tactic. And the idea of somebody turning up on a modern battlefield with a katana and sprinting at somebody with a rifle and thinking, yeah, I'm in a pretty good position here, I've made the right choice turning up to this battlefield with this particular weapon, means that it's very hard to just, in mechanical terms, give people different ways of dealing with the various problems that the game is asking. Whereas once you go post-apocalyptic, for example, there's a good reason why there's only one guy with a big gun, because bullets are super scarce. And there's a good reason why there's a whole bunch of dudes that only have like knives in their fists, because they're the lowly scumbags who have to gather together in large numbers. And so it explains why you play a horde close combat tactic and I play an elite long range tactic. And we've got one of the base tactical oppositions that are one of the main building blocks for every sort of skirmish game. The lots of dudes with sticks running at a few dudes with guns is pretty much there in almost every game you'll see. So personally, that's why the two reasons I think that it's quite a narrow church.
I think another reason that seems quite clear to me is that you want miniatures that are flamboyant and over the top. And for example, like in the last 40 years of cinema, like plenty of great action, thriller, violent stories have been told in very contemporary settings. And they can have stylish locations and they can have cool characters in them, but those characters tend to be dressed in modern dress, and they don't tend to be, they don't have to have flamboyant pauldrons and enormous, feathery hats, all of which are fantastic to paint and look great in 28 mil. And so it's kind of striking the number of modern combat games. And I don't mean that in terms of like a historical sense, by which I mean like, are you trying to replicate like current modern real world conflicts, which isn't a thing that I'm interested in doing. But like, am I telling a Jason Bourne story versus, a Space Marine story? Like, why should that be inherently more interesting and therefore more saleable, and many more tabletop games be written about them? Like, why is every other game set in a high fantasy realm rather than, a sort of basically just a CAD file sort of medieval world? And I think it's to do with the flamboyance of the miniatures, like you making ranges of extremely interesting and joyful to paint kind of real people is I think, like, it's the domain of historical gaming, and therefore it has its own different audience and it has its own different feel. And where, for example, I've been really interesting watching Sean Sutter explore his game Sludge, which is, he basically said, I wonder if I can take a bunch of sort of War of the Roses and Napoleonic miniatures and kind of kit bash them together and make something which feels like a kind of Mobius sort of styled weird fantasy rather than high fantasy. And I really like what he's doing with it, but it isn't something that I think, like, it's never going to be mainstream, and it's not something that seems to have, it's not something that a bunch of other people are doing and is a competitive landscape. So I think it's something to do with the flamboyance of the physical models as well.
I mean, personally, once or twice I have come across rule systems for contemporary modern warfare and sort of skirmish games about rioters versus police in like modern settings. And I have to say, I don't know if it's just me or if you feel the same way. I'm pretty squeamish about that sort of thing. I have to say, I do think that, I mean, the number of games that are about orcs kicking to death elves vastly outnumbers. I say I haven't looked this up, but I'm willing to bet penny to a pound on it. Vastly outnumbers the number of games that are about, modern soldiers fighting in Iraq, for example. Despite the fact that there aren't any orcs and elves, and there definitely are soldiers fighting in Iraq, and it's much more present to our modern day and our modern lives. And I wonder personally, I there's one thing for me personally is very much a feeling of I don't feel right marching a guy into harm's way who, there might be an actual person.
It might
somewhere.
be a real world analog for this. This is too close for. Yeah, no, I agree.
Yeah.
I agree, and I don't know if that's why. Yeah, no, I think that's right, and I think that squeamishness I definitely share, and that, I guess you can explain it away by saying, well, what I'm looking for is escapism, and I'm looking for something that's very divorced. But I think that's masking the real issue there, which is I'm uncomfortable confronting the fact that, like, I'm a sort of middle class war gamer with a comfortable situation, comfortable enough to be able to spend my money on toy soldiers, and I don't have to deal with this real thing that's happening, 5,000 miles away, but is actually genuinely happening. So I think it's definitely escapism. But I think, like, catching on the escapism thing, I think there's still a weirdness around. I can escape into a million possible fictional worlds, and yet there are a couple of really heavy clumps of what
Oh
those
yeah.
things look like. And you know, even like even big budget modern cinema is pushing much further in terms of different looks and feels
Oh yeah.
and fictional realms than anything that tabletop wargaming is producing, outside of a few really, you know, stylish corners here and there.
Yeah, absolutely. This is something that's personally a bit of a bugbear, and I don't think it's just movies. I think it boxed tabletop games, board games, as I say, and I'll bring this up whenever, you know, I have the opportunity. I'm pushing the envelope so much more, and tabletop, you know, war games, tabletop miniatures games that I do love deeply are just not making the attempt to tell different stories. So I say there's a very tight cluster of subjects. You could throw, you know, a 10p piece and cover all of them pretty much. And it's even to the point where it's like, and many of the games that use this theme I personally absolutely love, but how many Weird West games are there now? It's like, how pinpoint of a genre is Weird West for there to be? I think I can think of off the top of my head like 5 quite big Weird West. What the hell is that about? Why
Yeah,
is
like
there
no one likes that genre. No one makes movies. No
no?
one writes books about that. Sorry.
And the classic Wicked Wild Wild West.
Yeah, no, that is a bizarre bubble of reality in tabletop wargaming.
Yeah, and yet there aren't. It's like you say, there aren't games about. I mean, there are a few, but there aren't games about, you know, Regency dueling over a lady's. I mean, I think there's one about Regency dueling over a lady's hand, but there aren't many about. I know a whole range of world. It's like you say, Jason Bourne. I think we a while ago had a little conversation about a skirmish game where you're Jason Bourne and you're going through a train station and it's full of people and the bad guys are trying to track you and you're trying to. But if either of you cause a ruckus and alert the crowd, then it's going to become your job's going to become impossible. And why are we not? Why are we not attempting these things? Why are these things not popular as themes? Why honestly, why do you think it is that there isn't more envelope pushing? And it's like, I personally, I want to have games about I want to write a Jane Austen game where somebody has to sneak around and give a love letter to somebody else without being seen. That's the sort of thing. But and I understand that's insanely niche and no one's going to play that. But Jason Bourne with his guns and the people with the shooting and the spies, that's got to be.
So, I mean, the genuine reason that I do it is that I want to design games where people have already created wonderful miniatures that suit the game, and therefore people will play my game because it will be an excuse to play, to buy and paint, or to. It's not that it's an excuse; it's that it is possible to go out onto the internet and reasonably painlessly find some models that will function with that game. And I kind of got a little bit on the edge of that with Mystic Skies, where Mystic Skies demands that you have a wizard on a magic carpet. And happily, it turns out that making a magic carpet is really easy if you've got a Coke can and you cut out a little bit and you bend it and you stick any old wizard on the top. So that was lucky. But you know, if I'm going to tell you that my next game is a Jason Bourne sort of adventure game, I think the natural question is going to be, where the heck do I get all of these sort of bystanders for the train station from? Like, I just don't know where I would get those from, and I certainly don't know where I would get them from in practically large numbers for inexpensive enough costs that I would bother to even look at that game twice and pick it up. So in some regards, like, it's much more likely that I'm going to make a spaceship game or a fantasy battle game, because I can tap into either a huge pre-existing model set where there's a bunch of players who are like, oh, cool, I haven't got my goblins or my, you know, spaceships out for a while, and here's an excuse for me to do that. And so for me, as Mike, the person who makes games that I want people to have enjoyable tabletop experiences, but I don't want them to have a really, massive financial commitment to my weird game. That makes a lot of sense from that practical consideration. Now, I don't know that completely explains it, because I think you could probably still take a bunch of those models and maybe throw them out of context, or like Sean's sludge game is doing, like redefine what their context is in an interesting way. So I think there's an interesting challenge there. I think that's real. I mean, I've been sort of thinking about that in some, no, but that's still the same. I don't know why it is, because I'm thinking, like, I was, messing around with a, I think we were talking about in a previous thing, like messing around with a sales game, because I really wanted to make a sales game. I've always wanted to, because I love Man of War and I want to have my own crack at it. And I thought, well, I'll do that in the Gaslands universe, because that's funny and it will make some sense. But then the reason there is still, like, post-apocalyptic is giving me, like, all these easy explanations for, like, why is there a tank with a sail on it? Why am I using tanks but I have to use sail mechanics? Like, why are the ranges of the weapons so short? Like, why do they only have broadsides? Like, I don't know the answers to any of these questions, but post-apocalyptic just goes, okay, that's fine. You can just be that. That's as a wizard made it.
Yeah, it's the sort of magic wand drive for your for the explanations as to why things happen. I think so. In Futurama, they refer to the various drives in various sci-fis that let you get from one place to another many times faster than the speed of light as the magic wand drive, because that's the thing that every deep space sci-fi just has to go. This doesn't happen, but the whole thing falls apart if we don't just say, yeah, you can get from one star to another in 15 to 20 minutes, and that's
all right. I propose a challenge then. Let's both select one novel,
okay.
one novel that we think is off the beaten track genre wise, and then throw it at each other to try and build a functioning, fun prototype game out of. I don't have one. I don't have one at the front of my mind yet, but let's sort of see if we can find the way through this.
I mean, your issue there is that I recently wrote a game for Jean-Paul Sartre's No Exit. So I'm I'm horribly willing to pick something that is excessively impossible to write.
I'm currently reading The Space Merchants, which is a sort of 1984 novel about what happens when advertising companies rule the world and all politicians are puppets. It's rather prescient, actually, for 1952.
Yeah, it's about to say, is that not just a documentary that you're delving into? I think one of the things that's yes, we'll definitely do that. We'll come up with a novel. Maybe we'll post it in the comments, because it'll be a few weeks before we post this video. So we'll both come up with a novel that is achievable, that maybe the other person has already read anyway, and demand each other write it. And it won't be fantasy, post-apocalyptic, violent sci-fi, openly violent sci-fi, and see if we can do something with that. Also, I think one of the things that's interesting in relation to maybe avoiding modern warfare as a genre, I don't know, is there's a line in relation to simulationism, particularly scale. Scale is a huge problem if you're actually trying to do anything even vaguely simulationist with a modern rifle. If you've got a human being moving on foot across an area, and you want to also represent the effective range of the modern warfare rifle that they're carrying, then your scale is going to be absolutely insane. You're going to have miniatures that big on a table, the size of a football field half the time, and they're going to move about a quarter of a millimeter and then shoot 15 feet away at people. And I think that there is a lot of fudging already with sort of World War One, World War Two
But
miniature.
but this is Stormtrooper blaster logic. Like for
Hmm.
me, that's never bothered me because all of the movies that I consumed as a kid, just like, you know, this is pulp logic. It's just like it's like that stupid naked gun gag where they're both shooting at each other and it keeps cutting and they end up, they're just the other side of a tin can from each other.
Yeah, no,
Like I'm okay with that, but I see what
it
you
doesn't.
mean.
It doesn't. Yeah, it doesn't. It doesn't bother me in the least. I don't have any great interest in simulation of weapons, accurate simulation of modern weapons and tactics, or even any real weapons and tactics, frankly, doesn't hold a great deal of interest for me.
Mhm.
But what I do wonder is Jurassic Park, right? When when Jurassic Park came out, and still today, the CGI on the dinosaurs stands up,
Oh,
and
yeah.
I'm of the opinion that the main reason that is that nobody knows how a dinosaur, nobody's ever seen a dinosaur move. Whereas still to this day, the CGI of human figures walking around in some movies is sometimes pretty janky, right?
Mhm.
And partly one of the things I wonder about why modern warfare is a slightly less popular genre is maybe I'm fine with the simulationism of a bowman firing at a certain rate into a crowd of people running at him, because I've never seen someone firing a bow in anger at another human being. And I wonder whether, because what I do see is on the news, people firing, Kalashnikovs at other people and people being bombed out by, battleships that are parked, 20 miles offshore and they have no answer to it. As to whether it is that simulation that doesn't bother me in post-apocalyptic and doesn't bother me in sci-fi and historic would suddenly just jump out at me the way that a human moving ever so slightly wrongly in CGI just goes, that cannot be. As to whether I'd play one of those games and just go, no, just a minute, I saw this on the news last night. That's not how it happens. I don't know. I don't know if that's the case, but it's one of the things I wonder as to why some subjects are avoided, because people would the lack of simulation would jump out much more presently than in the sorts of, it's like you say, post-apocalyptic. You can just go, it's the post-apocalypse. People do mad things in the post-apocalypse. Guns fire weirdly. Yeah, they shouldn't fire like that, but they do because it's been, knocked together at home and make do and mended when their gun is held together with gaffer tape and hope.
It might also be, these are all theories that we're just tossing them out, but it might also be that there's just not been enough of them written yet. And that, I think, maybe has two impacts. One is people don't feel like they've hit the bottom of the barrel, although the bottom of the barrel is pretty close in some cases, but that also people are still really are really affected by their influences. And so I'm noticing that, the sort of cohort of games designers that we are part of were really influenced by Necromunda and Mordheim, and there's like a really strong Necromunda Mordheim flavor to just like 70% of the games on the market at the moment. And that, I think, is like, those two things are sort of interplaying in a weird way, where it's like there hasn't been enough just sort of junky redigestion of Necromunda and Mordheim for people to go, no more. Like, there needs to be something else. But then again, like in the same way that, like, when Magic the Gathering first exploded and got huge, like everyone and their dog released a CCG, many of which have never ever been seen again. And I have an incredibly bizarre old one about like Arab magic unopened in my thing right here about assassins and whatnot. And so and there was a ton of those things. And I guess, maybe there was a cohort that ran its that ran its course, and then people turned off that and realized that, you know, there was only a few really successful executions of that, and that if you had to come back and do a really successful execution of that, you had to have something kind of different. And maybe we just haven't hit that watershed because there's not enough of these games being produced or consumed.
I mean, I honestly don't know. And it's say we are just sort of theorizing and shitting our mouths off here. But I mean, I genuinely do wonder, because, like I say, in the box games world, the turnaround of things like legacy games, the movement.
People are still making dungeon crawl board games, even though no more crawl board games really need to exist. But I think at the same time, lots of people who might have made a dungeon crawl board game are going, yeah, maybe I'll make a farming sim or something else.
I mean, the speed with which Dominion went from being one game idea to having sort of, there are about 1 million deck builders, and deck builders of every flavor and type that you can possibly imagine. The speed at which Pandemic Legacy went from being one game to being its own subgenre within the tabletop world. I mean, I don't know. I don't know what the answer is, but I don't know why it is that there doesn't seem to be that sort of movement. I mean, you know, that sort of speed of movement on you know, sort of tabletop war games, on miniatures war games. I mean, you say that there doesn't seem to be that the people haven't reached saturation point on those sorts of things. And I don't know, it might be because I am, and I think you are as well, unusually steeped within, you know, what's coming out and what's available, what's being released. But I'm definitely at saturation point on a lot of that stuff. And I suppose I don't know. I suppose I just get disappointed every time I see a set of rules and I think, oh wow, I've always wondered whether that subject could be dealt with well and interestingly and done in an in-depth way and really worked out. And then I open it up and I go, oh no, it hasn't been though, has it? It's the same set of rules with a thin paste of theme on top. And it's every game I've ever played in my entire life, and it isn't this any.
But it might also be an artistic limitation of the medium. So, like, if I'm thinking about, like, you know, I can write a card game about trading jewels. I can write a card game about necromancy. I can write a card game about foraging mushrooms. I can write, and like all of these will be delightful rules interactions that can then evoke the mushroom flavor. But I can't necessarily, all of those themes don't really make any sense for a tabletop miniature game for a bunch of reasons. But because I think maybe because of a central assumption at the heart of all of this, which is there are two collections of combatants and they are going to duke it out somehow because it's called a war game. And so, like, I guess we can imagine a cat and mouse game about, like, stealing jewels in a market because it's physical, but we can't really imagine a tabletop miniatures game where you're trading jewels because the physicality of where you are in Cartesian space doesn't matter. And that's sort of one of the main things that you have for a miniature based game. It needs to be interesting where you are in a small space, which, you know, whether it's paintball or actual war, like, those relative positions to individuals in a small space matter.
I mean, we'll see. You know, we'll end up sort of trying to write some of the things. I would argue that almost anything can be done in such a way that it is interesting, whether or not somebody else sees you doing it. If there's a game about trading jewels around a marketplace, and if I see you trading a jewel, I know that value of that jewel is going to drop on the market, and I can react to it in some way. Well, there you go. It's instantly interesting whether or not you can get to the jewel trader without crossing my line of sight or not. But, you know, I would argue, I think that tabletop miniatures games are incredibly elastic. I think that they are available as a playground within which to work. But we will see. I suppose a question is to how much of a how much of a palette there is for these things in the world at large. But we will write a couple of games based on awful and difficult to write to novels at some point in the next month or so, and show them to the world and be roundly abused for having attempted such a thing.
I think being roundly abused is hoping for too much. We'll fling them into the audient void, and there they will settle, falling eternally through nothingness. And on that note, Mike on the rule of carnage. How to write miniature games that will be consumed by the void.
that will fall into the mordant void forevermore. Yes, on that incredibly upbeat and delightful note, we will sign off on in this episode of Rule of Carnage. Where you found this, there will be a comment section. Let us know what you think. And what you'd like to talk about in the future. If you're watching this as a video, it is available as a podcast for longer painting sessions. If you're on the podcast, check out our faces on YouTube. Reach out to us on Twitter, any other social media. But until next time, it's going to be goodbye for now. Bye.